Welcome once again to another DxO webinar. I'm your host, Photo Joseph, and we're going to start by looking at these images here, these two photos that look like they're the same because they are actually the same photo, one shot in color and one in black and white. And let me first start by explaining my thought process here. Quite often when I shoot, I'll shoot in RAW plus JPEG. And the reason I do that is I love the JPEG processing that can happen in my camera. And of course, pretty much every camera can do this now. And there's just different looks that you can either use as presets or design into the camera. And I like using those as inspiration. It's quite unlikely that I would ever actually use this JPEG file, but shooting in this grainy black and white mode as I was walking around the street to Los Angeles, it kind of gives me that inspiration for the type of photography that I'm creating. This is obviously a very, very different image than this one. And being able to look through the camera with a mirrorless camera, especially seeing the actual effect in real time, it just kind of helps to inspire me to get the types of shots that I like. So again, I'm showing you this as a inspirational starting point. This is what I had in my mind when I shot this picture. Now, as we look at these, I tend to try really, really hard to do all of my perspective correction, all of my straightening in camera. I want the camera as straight as possible, and you'll see that as you look through most of these presets in here and most of these images. I try to keep things as straight as possible. Sometimes there's an exception, and this is a photo we're actually going to look at, and I'll explain why that one is so crooked. But I try really hard to get the line straight, but of course sometimes either you can't, for physical reasons, you can't put the camera in the right place, for technical reasons, or here, for example, there's no way to get this totally straight without standing way up on a ladder. Here, maybe, here I was able to get very centered on this image, but the camera's just a little bit angled on here for whatever reason, I don't quite recall. A photo like this, I struggled really hard to get front and center in front of the Taj Mahal. It took a long time to get there, but those are the kind of things that I'm looking for. So composition starts, straight edges starts in camera when looking at the image through the lens, trying to get that as straight as possible. Something else you'll find, and this is very personal, it's just me, is that I tend to go for symmetry on left and right. That Taj Mahal image is a great example of that. It's kind of a Wes Anderson filmmaker thing, if you're familiar with him. I like things to be mirror imaged. It's just something that I kind of enjoy. And obviously that doesn't fit every photo, right? Like this is clearly not going to be mirror imaged, but I do try to go for those really straight and clean lines as much as I can. So with that in mind, let's go back to this first photo. And there's a few things going on here. Let's actually look at the black and white one to start, what I was seeing through the camera. Clearly, I'm in the photo, my shadow's in the photo. Now, I know that I do not want my shadow in the photo, but there's nothing I could do about it because of obviously where the sun was. And to get this particular angle and the perspective that I wanted here, I couldn't do that. So I shot this a little bit wider than I needed, knowing that I would just crop this out. So my intention when I shot this was to crop this out. And I think that's an important thing to think about. You do want to really think through the process from start to finish when you're shooting. I know that this is when I'm going to get into the computer, but I know while I'm shooting that I roughly want this type of a look, and I know that I'm going to crop this out. So that's what we're going to start by doing. But I want to point something else out to you. Notice there's a bit of curvature happening in here. See, there's a little bit of a lens curvature. You can especially see it on the telephone pole. And if we look back at the JPEG, we don't see that. So I'm shooting on mirrorless cameras. Specifically, this was shot on a Lumix G9, which is a Micro Four Thirds camera, and small sensor cameras tend to have a lot of distortion to them. And most of that distortion is actually corrected in camera, which is why this image doesn't have that distortion. It's leaning in, where we can still see that these lines are not parallel. They are leaning in towards each other, which is a very easy fix, and we are going to fix that. But there's no curvature because it's corrected in camera. But when I take the raw file and I look at it in an app like PhotoLab, if there's no correction happening to it, I'm going to see some of that curvature. Now, this image has no processing on it. You may recall from, if you've seen other demos, that in PhotoLab, wrong button, not check for updates. In PhotoLab, if you go into the preferences, you can set what the default preset will be for new raw images. In this case, what it's set to is DxO Standard. And that is found under DxO, oh, where is it? Where are they? Black and white, high dynamic range, DxO scene modes, nope. Portrait and landscape, oh, right here, they're the defaults, DxO Standard, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those are the default starting points for your images. DxO Standard is the one that it comes shipping with. When you first installed, this is what you have. DxO Standard is actually a lot of corrections already being applied. I have turned those off in here. What I did was I went into presets and I hit no correction so that we saw the image basically as it came out of the camera. Now, all raw processors are going to do some level of correction, but this is essentially having no correction done to it. And what I'm going to do next is reset it, which is going to be applying this DxO Standard button. So the reason I'm going through this to explain all this is when you first look at your image, it's actually, if you don't make any changes to your settings, it's actually going to look more like that. So you saw how the lines straightened out. If we go back to the, compared to the JPEG now, we're seeing those very similarly straight lines. This straightening happens by default in PhotoLab. I manually turned it off because I wanted you to see exactly what PhotoLab is doing. And this is a really important part of this. The fact that PhotoLab is doing so much to your image when you first take it, when you first open it, is pretty impressive. And it's more than just the straightening. It's actually a whole bunch of other stuff. Let me hit the reset again, which again is the same thing as if I open presets and I clicked on DxO Standard. If I scroll down here, you'll see that white balance correction may or may not have been applied, but it's now enabled. Smart lighting has been applied. Noise reduction has been applied. Cropping has been applied. Smart lighting, vignetting or devignetting, color rendering, special color rendering index has been applied. It's all of the lens sharpness, chromatic aberration. These are all things that have been applied by default. And if I turn all those off, then we see that original image. And again, just pointing this out because it's important to know with PhotoLab that all of these things happen when you first open the image. So let's continue with the photo. As I said, I know that I want to crop it. I also know that I want to straighten these edges. So let me just go into the crop tool for a moment. Remember, I've done that perspective correction automatically by hitting the reset. Notice here, if we open the crop, there's actually a little bit more of the image than what we saw in here, than what we're seeing. It's already cropping something. Well, why is that? Well, the image is cropped to the original aspect ratio. You see here it says original, and this is by default. When you do these corrections, it maintains the aspect ratio that came out of the camera. The thing is that sometimes the correction that happens in the software actually distorts the image. In this case, it made it a little bit taller or a little bit narrower, I suppose, depending on your point of view here. And if you want your aspect ratio to be maintained, then that's by default, and that's what it is. But I can turn that off. I can go in here and say, unconstrained, which is actually going to give me a little bit more image. It's a little bit taller now, but I want to do this right now because my next step of doing the perspective correction, I want to make sure that I've got all the pixels available. So if I'm going to do this process, I like to do the auto correction, but then go into the cropping and unconstrain, set that to unconstrained so I get all the pixels. Now, ultimately, I know that I will end up cropping it something like this. That's where I'm ultimately going. But for the next phase where I'm going to let the software do the correction, I actually want all the pixels available. So I'm going to leave it there to start. Next thing I'll do before I send this off to a Nik plugin for perspective correction is ensure that my shadow and highlight detail is in here. Because let's remember that when I send this off to the Nik Collection using this button down here, we're going to come into that. When I do that, the image is actually going to be rendered out as a TIFF file. That's what's going to happen. It's going to get rendered as a TIFF, which means it's no longer raw, which means if I'm not careful, I could end up throwing away some highlight and shadow detail. So I'm looking at this and I'm going, well, do I have any recoverable shadows or recoverable highlights? Well, let's take a look at the histogram to start. Go up here to the histogram and I look, and it looks totally clean. I can see that my shadows nicely ramp off and end, and my highlights nicely ramp down and end, and I'm not seeing any peaking, right? If I was to, let's say I took the exposure and crammed it up, and we see this wall right here, I've just clipped off highlights. If I was to send this off as an 8-bit TIFF, I would lose some of that highlight detail. So clearly I don't want to do that. Let me just undo that there. One way to make sure that you're not clipping is to turn on the clipping indicators right here. So that's your shadow clipping and your highlight clipping, and I'm not seeing any indicators. If I now take my exposure way up, we will see those indicators start to come in. So we know that that we would be getting some clipping in here if that were the case. That little sunlight there would indicate that, and then shadows going the other way would do the same thing. I'd start to see those in there. So again, let me just reset this. I can turn those off because I see that I am not losing anything. But here's an interesting point. Let me go back and just reset this again. And at this point, reset, take a look at that same histogram. The shadows are fine, but look at the highlights. We actually have some room to grow in here. So just to reiterate that original reset, original positioning, which again is on by default, so you don't have to do this. I'm just doing it for the sake of the demo. When I do that, I'm automatically exposure adjusting and stretching out the histogram to maximize the highlights and the shadows in the image. So if it was an underexposed image, it would have lifted it up to bring those shadows into range. If it was overexposed, it would have brought it down to bring the highlights into range. In this case, the image had a little bit of room to grow, and so the software did that for me. So now that I've reset it, I need to redo my crop. So let's just go back in here and set that unconstrained again. We got that full height back. Close that. I know that my exposure is good. Once again, verifying that from here. Very good. So now let's send this off to Perspective Effects. Perspective Effects is the new plugin in Nik Collection 3, which is going to allow me to do my perspective corrections on these buildings here. Just give that a moment to open up in here. Here we go. All right, so there's a lot of different ways to approach this. My favorite way to do something like this is going to be to use the perspective correction right here, starting with auto. I like to start with auto because, you know, why not? If I can fix the image with one click, then let's just do it. So I click that, and you know, it looks pretty good. It looks pretty good. My vertical lines are now vertical. So these two lines, if we focus on these here, those are now parallel. So that's looking good. Just to toggle that on and off so you can see. So that's been corrected. But I'm not totally convinced about my horizontal lines. Like this one here, it feels like it's a little bit of an angle. You know, the bottom of the building, maybe a bit of an angle. And this is a tough image for the software to really know what to line it up off of. What of these lines matter the most? And you know, there's this line on the street, there's the line at the base of the building, there's this up here, there's all the windows. The software can only do so much, and this might be perfectly fine, but maybe I want to do this by hand. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take over this manually. So let me just reset perspective and then bring up the 8-point corrector, which is my favorite way of doing this. The 8-point is the one that gives me the most control. And now I'm going to take these 4 lines, it's 2 vertical lines and 2 horizontal lines, and I'm going to line these up on 2 known vertical and horizontal lines in the scene. Now, a little tip for you, you do want your horizontal and vertical lines to be as far apart as you can. So it would probably be more accurate if I had nice lines way over here and way up here, but I don't. And so you just got to work with what you've got. So I'm going to go off of this edge of the building. You know, I could possibly go off of the window edge, but I don't know that, for example, this outside edge of the window actually lines up with this outside edge. I have no way of knowing that, but it's a pretty safe bet that this corner of the building is one straight continuous line. So we're going to assume that that is. Same thing over here. I've got this long line to go off of, well, long-ish. The farthest out vertical line would be this here, which if we look at this closely, and this is important, you want to look at what you're actually lining up to. This is some kind of, I don't know, metal or wooden frame that's there. I don't know if, I mean, that looks pretty straight. It probably is straight, but it's also not very long. So again, if let's just zoom back out of this, I would rather line it up on something a little bit longer. That just gives me a bit more accuracy. The horizontal lines, I'm going to go off of the rooftop here. I guess I could go off that rooftop, but I'm going to go off this one here because this building in the background could be slightly rotated, right? This building, which is pretty far back, could be at a slightly different angle than the one in front of me. So I want things that are on the same plane, same, or as close to as possible at least, the same plane as this main building, which of course is going to be this building. And then the bottom one, that's a tough call. I could do it off of the road, but there is nothing in the world saying that this line here is actually parallel to the bottom of the building or the top of the building here. So I don't really trust that. So I'm going to go off the bottom of the building. We can already see here that there's kind of some weird wiggling in here just because of the way that the building's, maybe the sidewalk is settled. Or I don't know. It's not perfectly straight. But, you know, sometimes you just got to wing it. You got to guess and you try a couple different things. And of course, you can adjust it as you go. So with all that in mind, let's get the first line set up. If you haven't seen this tool before, I simply move the vertical line roughly over the line that I'm going to line it up on, and then click on the circle here and drag this into place and get that precisely where I want it. Now to slow it down, you hold down the Shift key and that slows down the movement. You get that down. Let's go down to the bottom here. And you know, you can see that the edge of the building is not perfectly sharp. This is a little bit of a curve to it. So, you know, again, you're doing a little bit of guesswork here, but I'm going to say that's about right. Okay, let's get this line up. We want to make sure that we are on the same lines. So again, hold down the shift key to line that up. Down there, let's get it right about there, looking pretty good. So we can see the nice linear lineup now of these two. Now let's go for this one. This is a tough challenge because I've got a bunch of different lines I could go off of. So let's say I go off the bottom of the shadow, and then I go over here, and I guess the bottom of the shadow is probably a good way to do it. Maybe it is, but maybe there's something better. Let's go to the top of the roof. Let's go off of that. Let's go off the top of that roof there. And then I go to this one. Wait a minute, where's the top of the roof? Like, is it that line? No, that line? I don't know what it is. So again, being careful, going in here and looking closely. And here I determined that, okay, the top of the roof here was pretty good, but look what happened here is all this decay, or who knows what's going on. But it's totally messed up. So that's probably not a good line to go off of. So what is a good line? Well, that shadow line is pretty good. The bottom of this lip looks pretty clean. I'm going to base it off of that. So let's put this there, get that close to the bottom of that line. Again, shift key to slow it down. Over here, shift key to slow that down. I'm at the top of that shadow line. Okay, that looks good. Now let's go to the bottom of the image and let's do it here. We're going to go off of the bottom of the building, stretch that out. And this one is going to be very much a bit of guesswork in there, but I'm going to hope that that is about right. Okay, and then I'll hit the preview button. Hit preview and it does the correction. And with the preview enabled, you can see how the perspective has been changed. We see that it's been stretched, big keystone stretched this way, looks like a little bit more keystoning on this side. It's this big distortion to the original image that has given me this final result in there. Now, this final result we can see is cropped. If we don't crop it, then we're going to end up with all this negative empty space in there. But this is the naturally cropped image. So we'll go ahead and apply that, and that crops it in. But remember, I know that I want to crop me out of here as well. I could do that back in PhotoLab, or I can just do it in here. Let's go ahead and open up the crop tool, and we'll make this change. I don't care about the aspect ratio, so I'm going to take aspect ratio and just say unconstrained. It just lets me do it however I want to. And let's see how I'm going to crop it. Do I crop above my shadow there? Do I get a little bit more roof line? Looks like I could actually get a little bit more here, because remember, originally it was down here. And if we look on the left edge, that means that that's as far as I could go, because you can see here how we're hitting the edge of that image. But once I crop that up, I can actually pull this out a little bit more, which is great, because I want to get that whole window in there. I don't want to have my window cropped. I don't think that looks very clean. I want to have that window in there. So that looks, let's say right about there. And I'm looking very carefully, right? I'm looking at the shadows in here. That shadow's a bit distracting, so why not just crop past it? Just right about there. Perfect. I think that's pretty good. Okay, now let's look down here. I probably want to crop me out entirely, but I don't know, maybe I don't, because I like this line here. I want the base of that, so maybe I won't crop down all the way. All right, we'll try that. And then look over here, the Hotel Mayfair sign. Well, if I crop that out, that's going to be not great, so I don't really want to crop that out. So let's bring that in. But now I've got this empty space in here. So how are we going to fix that? Well, fortunately, back in PhotoLab, we'll be able to fill this data in relatively easily. It looks like we have some over here as well. So I think what I'll do is I'll apply it here. I'm going to know that I'm going to have to fill in this gap here. There's a little bit of a gap there, and I'm going to want to get rid of my shadow in there and probably that ugly thing on the sidewalk. That should be easy. And yeah, I think that's probably going to be a little bit better. So let's try that. Let's go ahead and apply that. And from perspective effects, it's a little bit funny. You actually hit save in here, and that'll save the image. And then, well, it's going to bring up a dialog in a moment. And then it kind of sends it back to PhotoLab. It's a little bit of a slightly different workflow, but there we go. We just hit save and off we go. As soon as that stops spinning. There we go. We're going to save this. It's saving it into the same folder as it was before. I'm going to go ahead and leave it at 8-bit at this point, hit OK, and it's going to save that, and then it will show up next to the original image back in PhotoLab. All right, that's done. Let's close this. And there's the adjusted image. Load that up. There it is. Okay, so there's the corrected image. I got the full Mayfair sign. I've got my vertical lines, but I've also got that gap. So now let's work on the gap. That's what I'm going to do next. Close the gap. Let's go into 1-to-1. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time getting super accurate about this because it'll take more time than I really want to spend here, but I will show you how this works. So I'm going to grab the repair tool here. I have two modes, repair and clone. In this case, I'm going to do repair. That's going to allow the software to do a lot of the work for me. And the size is about right. Feathering, don't want to feather this too much, so I think that's probably good. And I will start with this part of the image here. So I'm just going to kind of paint over this gap in here, this big black gap, and let's just make sure we get a little bit of extra outside of it. I know that I really want some extra in there. Let go, and actually pretty good. Sometimes it's kind of funny, you know, you prepare for a demo and it chooses some completely different part and you have to change it, and then you do it for real and it picked exactly the right spot. But look at that, it really lined that up nicely. So it's recreating that over there. Now that's because of the nature of this, it does appear to have cloned a little bit of it. So I can actually go in here, let's make this a little bit smaller, and let's clone out some of these other spots or just repair some of these other spots. And what's interesting about the repair tool in PhotoLab, if you've done this before in Lightroom, one of the things you can't do in Lightroom is paint over an existing repair. So this repair now has another repair on top of it, which is pretty cool. So that allows me to do things like make these changes when I've got a kind of repeating pattern. I can go in and sample out some of these other pattern bits and select something different. So like you can see that little white thing there is a clone of that. So let's just paint over that and then choose another spot of the image for that to copy from. And there we go. I think that looks pretty good. All right, I'll do a couple more. Let's just make these really quick though. Let's see here. Let's go ahead and move up a little bit here. Let's see if we can get the rest of this. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And I will start, I guess we'll start here, kind of go up and all the way up to that edge. There we go. And let's see what it chooses. Okay, so this time it shows something totally wacky. It appears to have chosen something from way at the top of the image. If I zoom out of this, we can see it shows from up here. Totally not what I want. So I'm gonna drag the source back down to here. Let's zoom back in so we can clearly see what's happening. And now I'll take this and line this up. So let's go. And I'm looking at this gray line on the door and trying to line it up over here with that gray line. So let's just move that until we find the nice alignment. A little bit too much there, down a touch. There we go. So now I've got a nice alignment in there. I'm sure there's things I could do to make this a little bit cleaner, but this is going to be good enough for now. We'll just leave it there. I do actually want to get rid of my shadow over on the middle, so let's get rid of that as well. And we'll just do a big fat clone out of that. And I'm going to move this to the other side so it's not cloning out the graffiti. And yeah, that's pretty good. Let's get rid of a couple of these spots so that they don't match. We don't want to have that replicant happening in there, and just choose from different spots. Looks like we got a little cleanup to do on the bottom there. All right, cool. It's probably do a little bit more cleanup, but I'm good. It's good enough for now. We'll just close that for now. Okay, so we've cleaned that up mostly. Again, could be better, but for the sake of the demo, it works out pretty well. Zoom out, and now I've got this completed image. Don't forget, you still got this one to clean up, but this is fine for now. Okay, so remember, this thing started with the idea of going black and white. So now let's take it to that next level, shall we? Let's take it black and white. To do that, I'm going to go Nik Collection again. This is the default, but I want to make sure that you're aware of this. I do want this to process as a TIFF. I don't want to open the original without processing because I have all these PhotoLab corrections that I've just added to it that I need in there. So I'm going to reprocess it as a new TIFF, which again is the default. And let's go into Silver Effects Pro. This is my favorite plugin by far of all time. I love Silver Effects Pro. I love doing black and whites in here, and this is where we're going to work. Now, if you have not seen Nik Collection 3 before, here's one of the major new features. We've seen this in Lightroom Classic. We also have this ability in PhotoLab. Because I'm working with a TIFF, I am now working with what's called a multi-page TIFF. This allows me to re-edit my corrections later. So it tells me here, since I've imported my image in a TIFF format, I have the ability to resume editing later. Enable this option by clicking the checkbox next to the cancel and save buttons. That's down here, this little checkbox, and it's already on. Save and edit later will allow me to, as you might imagine, save this and then go back and re-edit it later. So let's make some changes. Let's have some fun with the black and white. I'm gonna go through a couple of presets to start because that's always a fun place to begin. Well, I kind of like that one actually. High contrast. Let's try a couple more. I'm probably gonna come back to that. That one's a bit too high contrast. I love starting with the presets in Silver Effects Pro. It really gives me the ability to get kind of inspired and find what's gonna work for this image. That high structure is good. And let's see, which do I prefer? High structure or high contrast to start? I'm gonna go with the high contrast, actually. I like that. I do wanna get a little bit brighter in here. This has gone a little bit too dark if we compare it to the original. And when you compare original, you're not looking at the original color. You're looking at a very base default black and white conversion, which is helpful here. So I can see there's plenty of detail in those shadows. I've just obscured it with this really contrasty preset. So let's pull some detail back in there. I'm gonna do that with control points. So let's add a control point. I'm gonna start just right in the middle of this, and I'm really gonna turn on my control point mask so I can see exactly what's being affected. And I could do one control point to select that whole area, but we can see how it's gonna select a lot of this as well. Or I could make this control point a bit smaller and then option drag this to make multiples of these. And I've got 3 of those, 3 smaller ones, and that's affecting that area pretty nicely. That's all right, I'll select all 3 of those, group them with the group button. So now I have a single control point commander, if you will, that will control all 3 of those. But as we can see from the mask, it is going to affect a lot of these shadow areas in here, and I really don't want it to. So I'm going to add another control point, and let's just drop that onto there, and we are, maybe not, let's see, do we want to go there? No, we definitely do want it on that shadow, and that's going to protect that shadow because this is effectively a whole new set of corrections. I'm just not going to actually apply anything to it. So let's just add a few of these down here. I just kind of want to pop around the image, and I don't need to be perfect about it. I don't need to make this solid black, but I really do want to avoid too much change happening to these parts of the image here. All right, I think this is going to work out pretty well. Make that a little bit bigger in there, and let's try it. So let's hide the masks. There we go. Go back to this main image, take the brightness up, and just a little bit in there, and there we go. We're pulling some of that detail back in, and you can see that that had very minimal change on the rest of the image. We could toggle the selective adjustments on and off, and we can see the change that it did do. And if you want to add a little bit more, back into these, like let's say that it brightened this up too much, I'll just add another control point onto the building there, and I could darken that a little bit or just leave it right where it was. I think that's pretty good right there, actually. I like that. Actually, I think this is a little bit bright, so I'm going to grab another control point, add another one down here, make that a little bigger, and pull the brightness down just a hair, just a tiny bit. Dig it. Okay, now remember that first black and white had a lot of grain to it. I love grain, I must admit. I used to shoot film, so I'm kind of partial to it. So I'm going to go over here under film types, and while I could choose any one of these other film types, because I didn't start here, any one of these that I choose is going to pretty dramatically change the overall image. So I'm actually not going to do that. Instead, I will just take my grain and add some in, just drag that down. And I got to say that the grain pattern in Silver Effects Pro is really, really clean. It looks really good. Okay, dig it. I like it. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. We're going to apply that, and I think we're going to call that image done, which is a great opportunity for me to turn the camera back on, say hello again, and take a look at the questions that have come up. All right, first question. Do you use an in-camera guide to get things straight? Absolutely. So in my camera, and of course your camera might be different, but in my camera, I can enable guides. I can have rules of thirds guides. I can have, maybe it's more lines than that on there. There is a horizontal, what do you call it? Level. There's a level, kind of a spirit level, digital spirit level that's in my camera. So when I'm looking through the viewfinder, I can tell if the camera is level or not. Use that all the time. Basically, the grid and the level I never turn off. I'm always looking at those. And so I will use those lines to ensure that my lines are as straight, either vertical or horizontal, as possible. Again, with buildings, often it's impossible to get both the same. So you got to choose which one you're going to go with, depending on where you're standing and your subject and so on. But yes, I absolutely use those lines all the time. It is always my personal goal to have as little work as possible that has to be done in post. Clearly, there are things that can only be done in post, and sometimes those are creative and sometimes those are corrective, but I want to do as much as I can in camera. I never want to just take a picture and go, fix it later. I will do everything that I can to make that image as clean as possible to start with, so that when I get into post, I'm doing as little as I can, because love this software, but let's be honest, I'd rather be out shooting. That's just kind of the way it is. I'd rather be shooting than spending more time than necessary in front of the computer. And by doing that in camera as much as I can, that allows that. But when I do have to make those corrections, you got these great tools for it. Next question, initial workflow question. Do you start with PhotoLab? Can the raw file be easily brought over from Lightroom if that app is used for cataloging images? Yes. So Lightroom Classic has a send to PhotoLab command, and it is sending the raw file to PhotoLab, which is a great workflow because I understand a lot of people are using Lightroom Classic and don't want to switch as their main asset management tool, their DAM tool. They don't want to switch that to something else. But PhotoLab offers some pretty outstanding correction tools, especially for things like prime noise reduction. That's just fantastic in here. The basic corrections on here are fantastic. So what you can do is from Lightroom Classic is send the image over to PhotoLab and do those corrections, whatever you're doing, and then send back to Lightroom the TIFF file. So that's absolutely a totally legitimate and easy to do workflow. If you're using Lightroom Cloud version, this Lightroom CC, the integration's not as clean because Lightroom CC does not have a plugin architecture yet. I don't know what Adobe's waiting for, but there is no plugin architecture. So you can still do it. It's just a bit of a workaround. You have to export the original raw file from Lightroom, open that up in PhotoLab, do whatever you're doing, save out a TIFF file, and then re-import that TIFF back into Lightroom. It's tedious, it's a few extra steps, but it works. And at the end of the day, it's not about making it easy, it's about just getting the job done. So that's how that works. Next question, why don't you do the perspective correction directly in PhotoLab 3 instead of Nik Collection 3? What are the advantages? Well, I think you saw by now that question might have come up when I first opened it in perspective effects, but all that, the linear corrections in there, that's an incredible amount of control. And with the cropping on top of it and just all that, there's so much control in there that I don't have in PhotoLab. So if I'm gonna do it, I'm just gonna take it over to perspective effects and do it there. Next question. Oh, please show the magnifier again in perspective effects. And is there one in PhotoLab? The magnifier was that. I wonder if that was referring to when I was dragging the lines. That just pops up automatically. So let me think, am I going to go? I may not go back into perspective effects again, but that when you clicked on that line, the horizontal or vertical line and the white dot at the end of it, when you click on that, it just automatically zooms in. That does not actually happen in PhotoLab. That's something I hope that gets added later because it's a great function, frankly, to be able to get really, really close to see exactly what pixels you're dragging that line onto. Super useful. The best you can do in PhotoLab would be to just zoom in multiple steps and get in as close as you can to position it. But no, that zoom in feature is just automatic. It just pops up. All right, last question for now. How do you get the photos in PhotoLab? How do you get the photos into DxO PhotoLab? Okay, how do you choose the plugins? I could not see where you chose them. Okay, PhotoLab as an asset management tool is you don't have an import function. There is no import because what you're doing in PhotoLab, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my screen, my video right now is to free this up. Okay, the way that you work in PhotoLab is when you go to the photo library tab, you are literally just looking at your hard drive and you click on a folder full of photos in your hard drive and that shows you all the pictures in it. There's no import process. So if you're coming off of the memory card, then you would just copy your photos into a folder following your own folder structure. So you got to build your own structure in the Finder or the Explorer on Windows, and then you simply point to that folder here and that just loads them up. So that's all there is to it. Now when you make adjustments in here, let's see here, let's go to, where's the raw? So go to this raw image and let me reveal this in the Finder. You'll see that next to it, sort by name here we go, next to it, so that was it, 100 or whatever 52, that's the image. There's this new .dop file. That is the PhotoLab sidecar. Let me shrink this down a little bit, you'll see here, PhotoLab sidecar file. That is the metadata that is explaining the corrections that are made here. In fact, let's just do this real quick. I'm gonna open this up and let's see here. Let me just do something dramatic. I'll take the exposure way down on this, right? So we know that, what am I doing? Interesting, the thumbnail is not updating. The thumbnail's updating. There we go. So I just made this big correction here, right? This is non-destructive, meaning if I go back into here and I delete this .dop file and I go back in, Let's load it back up again. It is, did I do the right one? 52. Oh, no, I did do the right one. Well, it's taking its sweet time, but it should just reset and show you the native image in there. I don't know why it's not, well, if I relaunch it, it'll certainly do it. That's weird. Anyway, but that DOP file, that's the metadata file that stores all of that. Okay, let's move on to, get rid of this here. All right, let's move on to another image. I am going to choose this one next. This one's got a few different things going on here. First of all, we see that the image is crooked, and you're probably, oh, I'm sorry. Let me back up the second half of that question. I did not answer. I'll come back to this in a second. Second half of that question was, how did I get to the filters? The Nik filters, it's right here. There's a button down here that says Nik Collection. You click on that, and it opens up a palette, a plugin selector, so you can choose which plugin you want. So there's the answer to that question. All right, let's try this again. Next up, I'm going to take a look at this photo here. This image has a couple of different things going on. First of all, it's crooked, and you're thinking, dude, seriously, you couldn't hold the camera straight? Well, no, because I didn't have a tripod. This is a long exposure, and as you can tell by the duration of the car lights on there, and I needed to stabilize it. So this camera is quite literally resting on the handrail, and I don't remember why, but for whatever reason, the stable place that I could rest it on was crooked. Now, you might think, well, that's bad. Now you have a crooked shot. But of course, correcting that is easy. So I would much rather have a totally sharp shot that has no motion blur because I couldn't hold the camera straight than have a straightened image in camera, right? I can easily correct this in post. So I stabilize the camera. If that means it's crooked, then so be it. So that's why that image is crooked. I think I have another example here of the same thing. Let's see here. Was this one a long? No, that was not a long exposure. Anyway, anytime you see a long exposure photo that's crooked, that's why, because I had stabilized the image, stabilized the camera by putting it on some other surface. A great tip here, if you're doing night photography and all you've got is your car to put your camera on, just rest the camera on the hood of the car, and if it's a little bit of an angle, you can fix that in post. Okay, so I'm going to fix this not in perspective effects, but simply by using the straightening tool here in PhotoLab. So there's the straightening tool at the top. I grab that. I can just move this line around, or I can drag a line across. So I'll go ahead and just drag this line across. There's a nice big wide barrier in there, and you can see it's now straightened that out. I could go in here and zoom into this. Let's go zoom in nice and tight and make sure that my lines are nice and clean. So again, ensuring that you're on the right axis is a good idea. So there's a good spot there. Let's move this over, and let's see, I was a little bit high. Let's get that down there. Okay, good, looking good on there, looking good. Hit the preview button, it straightens that out, hit apply, and off we go. Now, depending on how you drag that out, because I had manually dragged it out like that, it may end up not recropping the image. So that's easy enough to fix. Of course, I go into the crop guide, and as soon as I enable that, as soon as I click it, it's going to auto crop within the constraints. Click on close, and now that image is cropped the way I want it to be. So that's all set and ready to go. All right, so now what am I going to do to the image? Well, once again, I want to verify my exposures. I want to make sure that nothing is underexposed or overexposed, and a good way to do that is to go up to the histogram and click on the clipping indicators. Now I can see in here that it actually is clipping some highlights, but let's look at what the image is. It's these headlights, the tail lights, the street lights. That's okay. That's okay that they are blown out like that. Now this particular image, if I should have done the reset first, let me hit the reset button again. It is probably not going to do a whole lot of anything. And that's because this image does not have a corresponding DxO module. Now, this is something we haven't talked about yet today, but I've talked about it a bunch before. If you look under DxO modules, you have this thing called, you can manage DxO optics modules, and it shows you all the modules that have been installed. So for example, the last image I was working with was a photo from a G9 shot on a 12mm lens. And so there is the optics module for that camera and lens combination. This photo does not have an optics module because, look at this, there's no lens data. The reason there's no lens data is because this is actually shot with a vintage lens, which explains the kind of inherent softness and glowing of this image. This is native to the glass that I shot this with. So there is no there is no optics module that is going to help this image. So I have to do it all by hand. So I should have done that earlier because now I have to redo my my straightening, but now let's just redo the straightening in there real quick, straighten that out, and we will have the go back to the corrected image. Where do I want to go? Zoom in close in here, go back down, and let's get that close right on that line and right on that line there. Okay, apply that, zoom back out, and okay, that it maintained the crop there. So this building, these buildings, vertical buildings, are quite straight. I could, of course, bring this into perspective effects and make really, really, really sure, but it's good enough for me. I want to do something else. I want to have some more fun with this. But I want to crop it. So I'm looking at this image. Remember what I said in the beginning of how I like even, I like kind of that Wes Anderson total mirrored effect, that very, very, very balanced shot. And this one is not. And we can tell, there's a couple ways we can tell. First, if you just look at it, you might be able to see that this road is not straight down the middle of the shot. So that's one indicator. But here's another indicator. Look at these, I don't know, these beams, I guess. Look at the line coming down and see where the line ends on the edge of the image here. Ends like, I don't know, a little bit up from the corner. Look at this line. It goes right into the corner. So, well, that's not cool. So I need to crop this because I want that to be straight. So I'm going to go back into the crop tool. And again, I do not care about the aspect ratio of the image, don't care at all. So I'm going to turn that off, turn off the constrain, and then move this wherever I like. And so let's go, let's see here. I'm going to watch this edge and see where it hits the edge of the photo. So we can see here it's hitting right about there. That's looking pretty good. Could also look at the front of this. Here's another good way to indicate it. Look at the guidelines, and those guidelines, by the way, are turned on and off right here if you don't see them on yours. And I see this kind of triangle happening in here. Good. So that's a pretty good positioning, right? If I make this a little bit like that far, so that triangle doesn't match that one. See, that's tiny, that's big. If I go back the other way, that one's big, that one's tiny. So let's get those even. And I'm just eyeballing it, but there, I like it. My road looks pretty even. You can see the road comes to roughly the same spot in the middle of this square. I'm gonna call it even. I like it. Okay, so now I've got my perspective the way I want it. I've got my crop the way I want it. I've got this even balance to it. Now let's have some fun with the image itself. So I'm going to go into Nik Collection again. And this time I'm going to use Color Effects Pro 4. We're going to have a little bit of a color fun to this. And this image already has this inherent native softness / glow to it because of that vintage glass, as I explained earlier. But I want to enhance that. I want to take that to the next level. So I think what I'm going to do is use a filter here called Glamour Glow. So just by the way, in case you're not familiar with Color Effects Pro, let me give you a very quick, very brief tour for those who are not familiar with it. On the right-hand side here, you have a filter stack. It is currently empty. I just cleared it out. It's currently empty. On the left, you have all of your filters. So if I add a filter, I just click on one, let's do something really dramatic like bleach bypass. I add that, it adds the filter up here. And now I can make some changes to it. Cool, make changes to that. If I click on another filter, like, I don't know, foliage, it will replace that filter. So look, now there's foliage, but what happened to the one before? What happened to cross-processing or whatever I chose? Bleach bypass, it's gone. That's because whenever you click on one of these, it replaces this filter until you click on add filter. Adding filter adds a filter holder, and now I can add another one. And then I can add another filter, and I can add another filter holder rather, and add another filter to it. So you get here now 3 different filters in here, and you can keep on adding these all you want. So that's how this works. You add filters from here over to here. When you want a new one, click on add filter. It adds an empty filter holder, and then you add another filter to it. Okay, let's get rid of all this. Clear all those out, and I want to add Glamour Glow because I like the glow. I just want to make it bigger. So let's take this Glamour Glow and let's just crank that up. I kind of dig that. I mean, look at the way it's treating the highlights down here. The building here is taking on this nice softness with just an enhanced glow of what I already had. Kind of like that. So that's neat. All right, that's cool. I also have a warmth slider in here. The colors in here are very, very blue, and if I remember correctly. I might be wrong, but if I remember correctly, when I shot this, I think I intentionally shifted the white balance manually to make it look even cooler, which I like down here, but not so much up here. I kind of want to put some warmth into this. So let's actually just start by taking the glow warmth and adjusting that. And if I go to the left, it gets cooler, and I actually really quite like it. It gets even bluer in the front. And if I go to the right, it gets warmer, and I quite like that warmth for the back. So I like this setting for this part of the image, and I like this setting, maybe not that much, yeah, right about there, let's say, for this part of the image. Well, we're going to use those control points again to correct that. So we'll start with the foreground here. I want this front part to be this kind of bluish color. So let's go ahead and add a control point, and we'll just start by dropping it onto the center beam on there. And I am definitely going to want to watch my masks and see what I'm affecting in here. And I mean, it's actually pretty good right there. I just do that for that part of it. Well, I guess we'll leave that one there, okay. And then I'll option drag this to make a new one over to here. Let's make that a bit smaller. And it looks like maybe I want to go, so I don't want to get too much of the street. I mean, I'll definitely be able to block some of it out, but let's try this and make that a little bit smaller. I'm getting too much up here, but we're gonna go and we're gonna take care of that in a moment. Let's option drag over here to make another new one. Okay, so I've got these 3 that are correcting this. In fact, I think I could let's do another one there too. Yeah, that's good. Drop that down a little in size. All right, so this area here, these 4 will be affected nicely by that effect, but there's still too much spill happening over here. So let's get rid of this. Let's go into, first of all, let's group all of these. So I have a single adjustment now for all of those, but then let's add a negative control point to the street to kind of protect that. And I'm just going to option drag this around to do a few more protection areas. I just basically am trying to not have that coolness added to any other part of the image. So with the control point group 1 enabled, and the mask is enabled, you see that here, I can see what it will affect. By having these other control points not enabled, I'm able to visualize what's going to happen when I adjust this, but not these. I can still, if I turn this off and I turn these masks on, we will see what that is going to affect in there, except that we're seeing it as black because they're all set to negatives. They're all set to a 0 application opacity. So it just kind of helps to visualize that for us. Okay, so with that off, let's go back over to this control point. We are again adding warmth to this, or adding coolness to it, sorry. So now as I make these changes, we are seeing this primarily just happening to the foreground. So let's take the warmth all the way up, take that way down. So that's great. I've got that coolness in there, digging that, protected the background area. But now let's add another filter to make that background warm. So I'll just hit add filter. I'm gonna add the same one, Glamour Glow. Let's take the warmth way up on that. Nice, it's doing a nice effect back there. Let's make it even bigger on there. Let's add a control point to that back area. Let's make sure that we are just affecting that back area there. And let's see here, a little bit more saturation as well. And because this is now kind of fighting with the one I did before it, I'm actually gonna move this, change the position of it. I'll move the warm one behind it. The way that these filters work is they are a cascading effect. Whatever happens here gets passed on to the next one, passed on to the next one. So depending on your filter stack, rearranging these could have a huge difference, huge implication to it. In this case, I am warming the background, I'm warming the background of the image, which is facilitated with a control point and facilitated by being behind the cooling one. So that warmth is way up. So you don't want to make that glow even, oh yeah, there we go. Let's make that glow even bigger. Pretty slick, I like that. Let's do a compare. There's the original and the new one. I like it. That's really cool, right? You got this really nice warm glow in the background. We still have these crazy blue lights in here, which complements the blues in here, but I've also got the warm trees and some warmth on the streets, and I think this overall looks pretty awesome. So yeah, we've got a nice warm glow up here. Let's actually make sure that we're getting that. We add another control point up here. I want to really make sure I'm getting that warmth up there on this, on the reflection on the building. Yeah, pretty good. I like it. Okay, let's save that. And that's going to save that out. And there we go. It's thinking, it's drawing, it's thinking, it's drawing. Load the right TIFF. There it is. Superb. I love it. So again, perspective is a huge part of the correction in here, making sure that my image was, well, straight to begin with, balanced the way that I want it to be, nice and centered, that again, that very evenly balanced image that looks good, and then going in and doing some color effects to it on top of that. All right, let's see, we've got a couple other questions coming up here. Let's pop the camera back on. Hello again, everybody, and let's see if I can answer your questions. All right, first one, I just said that I send a file from Lightroom Classic to PhotoLab 3 as a RAW. Did you mean that versus a TIFF? Yes. Okay. So from Lightroom, you have 2 ways to send your photos. If you send a photo using the standard open in, which is basically using a plugin, that could be a Nik Collection plugin, it could be any other plugin, it could be PhotoLab even, you will have that step where you choose how you're going to process the file. Are you going to send it out as a TIFF, as a JPEG, whatever you like? If you want to send the actual raw file, it's a different process. It's a different command under, I don't remember the menu right now, but it's a different command where you are sending the raw file specifically. It's not the standard plugin path. It's somewhere under the file menu. It is a specific path to, it's actually a plugin in Lightroom that hooks into PhotoLab, and so it allows you to send the unprocessed raw file from Lightroom to PhotoLab. The idea here being, Lightroom's a great raw processor, right? Well, PhotoLab is also a great raw processor, and in many ways, it's a better raw processor. So if you want to process your raw file in PhotoLab, then that's how you would do that while still using Lightroom as your asset management tool. All right, hopefully that answers that. Next question. With the optics modules come automatic corrections, chromatic aberration, smart lighting, automatic white balance, and anti-vignetting. Correct. My question would be, can I manually set which corrections would be done automatically and which should not be? I know I can deactivate them afterwards. You could, yes, you could. You would save a new preset. So let's say that, let's get a new image in here. Let's pull up a photo here, this one, okay. And let me do a reset on this so it goes back to its native setting. Actually, this one I think has a better vignette. This has a good strong vignette to it. Okay, yeah, this one has a strong in-camera vignette. We can see this happening up here in the corners. I'll do a reset. That's gonna do all the correction, including the devignetting. But I decide that I don't want it to devignette. So I scroll down and turn that off, and there we go. So now my vignetting is back. Okay, so now let's save this as a new preset. So I go to my preset editor here. I haven't done this in forever. Let's see, I guess we need to select a collection. New preset from current settings, here we go. And I'm gonna call this my starting point. Okay, so I've just created a my starting point. And now I could set this as the default. Let's go up to the preferences and change the default to my starting point. And now whenever I load up an image, so that same image, I will hit the reset button. Remember, the reset is effectively applying that first reset is applying what we have set in the preferences. It's applying this. So reset back to my starting point. So there we have saved a new starting point by altering the preset the way I want and saving it as a new starting point. That's how that works. As far as what's internal to the module, there are things that are internal to the module that you don't have control over. But stuff like the vignetting and so on, the things that you mentioned, those are all there. Super. Thank you so much once again for tuning in today. I do appreciate it. Lovely to see you, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.